Hey, my name is Lester Spence. I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. And what I wanted to do really quickly is test out YouTube as means of delivering ideas that I don't necessarily have the time to write about in depth. And also as a vehicle, given that, of sending out ideas to a wider viewer base. And what I wanted to do was start out by talking about real quickly about the black family, and then make a tie between arguments about the black family to recent arguments made by Bill Cosby about some of the ills facing black communities and the prescription for those ills. The quick and dirty line is that I understand Bill Cosby cares a great deal about black communities and wants to work really hard to try to solve these problems. But what he ends up doing in making his arguments is moving us away from political and economic considerations and towards cultural considerations. And while culture does play some role in the issues we deal with, what we really need to be dealing with are political solutions. The problem isn't that black people have something wrong with them culturally, genetically or otherwise. The problem is that we've moved away from using the government to take some of the burden off of our backs, and that ends up hurting us. And then in the long run, that ends up hurting others as well. So quick and dirty, when we think about the family, we think about it in very naturalized terms, and we can really easily trace what the what the genealogy of the family is, or what the roles of people are within that family. So the husband, for example, is supposed to be the provider and is the public face and is on top, right? The wife is supposed to bear and raise children, and is supposed to manage the household. She's like here, and then the kids, for example, are just supposed to be kids, right? That's a quick and dirty. And then legally, the husband has certain rights over the wife, and we don't really like to talk about this, but until even the 1990s, in some cases, in some states, it was illegal or impossible for a wife to actually accuse her husband of rape. It wasn't possible, and that's because legally the husband is viewed as having property rights over the wife. Marriage is a property contract. So when you're standing up there, when you actually look at a wedding ceremony as performed traditionally, one of the first things that should stand out is that the man is already up there waiting, and the woman is brought up by her father, and the pastor or the father, the person performing the ceremony, often gives her a name. That is, we're here to give Sean Smith to this man, right? So even in the language, what you can do is you can see the property contract in the ways that ideas about law and property are embedded in the quote unquote natural concept of marriage, right? So how is that complicated here in the United States by the presence of black people? Well, one way is simple. Black people actually can't have families until after slavery, and arguably even sometime after that, right? So, for example, enslaved Africans didn't have any property rights. So black men couldn't possibly be the head of their household because they had no houses to be the head of the household over, right? They were enslaved. Black women, the same thing. They didn't have, we talk about how, or I allude to the fact that women in general, up until recently, didn't have control over many aspects of their bodies. Enslaved Africans had less control than that, right? So one of the things that distinguishes American forms of slavery from other forms of slavery, even during the same time period, is that enslaved Africans were viewed as property, chattel slavery. What that means is there is no, there are no legal rights, and you can basically do pretty much anything you want to them, and they have no legal recourse. You can separate, even if they, and so one of the ways black people resist this is by creating their own rituals dealing with marriage. So we have the jumping the broom ceremony, for example. But even with this cultural act of resistance, it could not stand up against the state. So let's say that John and Jane are enslaved Africans, and they decide that they love each other and they want to create a cultural ritual that emphasizes their love and is married. And they marry, or they jump the broom rather. If John and Jane's slave master wanted to sell John, Jane had no recourse. If John and Jane had children, and the slave master wanted to sell the kids, John and Jane had no recourse. So that's really, really important. So we've got the black family unit existing kind of outside the state, and that the government is the entity that enforces laws regarding marriage, that enforces the various legal rights, but the state here didn't recognize these people as citizens, or even as people, right? So you jump forward to the modern era. Well, not to the modern era. Jump forward, say, 70 years. No, let's make that 80, 90 years. Jump forward to about the end of slavery to 1940, right? So I'm totally skipping over Reconstruction. I'm totally skipping over the beginning of Jim Crow, and I'm going deep into the middle. So in the 1940s, there's a guy named Gunnar Myrdal. He writes a book called An American Dilemma. He's tasked by American foundations to study the American race problem. He's given a ton of money to conduct serious social science research to figure out what the state of American race relations are. So what he does is he comes up with an argument that in some ways mirrors Du Bois's double consciousness argument made some 40 years earlier, but he doesn't really refer to it like that. What he argues is that America's problem is that white Americans have two sets of values. They have one set of values that they use for that they use in regards to each other. You know, these values are the American values we think about, you know, support for democracy, support for equality, support for liberty, freedom, etc., etc., etc. But then they've got this other groove over here, right, where they totally ignore those values and go against those values in regards to black people specifically, but then you can expand that also to include Native Americans and other non-whites, right? So the problem was that you had these two competing value sets that produced a form of psychosis within white America. And the way to best deal with the race relations problem is to get people to understand this psychosis and then reconcile these two value systems, right? Now, what does that have to do with the black family? There's a section that most people don't really cite where he talks about what the problems are within the black community. And he makes the argument that even given racism, the black communities, if you were to remove racism in all of its forms, the black community would still be subjugated and oppressed, because their problem was not so much racism, but it was that their family structure was problematic, right? Now think about what racism is at this time. So we think about race, oh, well, it's not just about black people and white people being in separate spaces. Right? Oh, wow, it's so messed up that black people have to use one set of bathrooms and white people have to use another set. Or it's so messed up that black people have to look, can't look white people in the eye. That's one way to think about it, right? But another way to think about it is as a form of deep oppressive terrorism. Yeah, terrorism. That's the way. Think about black people being lynched at the rate of one a day in some cases. Think about black sharecroppers in the South